My story of surviving and healing after generational child sex abuse trauma. Well, why the sunglasses and the hat and the scarf in the middle of the summer inside? Well, I was hacked in January 2020. I used to rent out rooms on Craigslist, and that augmented my income and helped me cope with the expense of living. But I received more than the usual number of replies to my post, and only one person came by to look at the house, to look at the room. Most of them ghosted me, never responded when I asked what happened. And I realized that there was a massive organized hacking organization that had taken over Craigslist and the internet. And ever since then, I've been bedeviled more than the usual number of emails and phone calls from mysterious sources that don't leave messages, or just there's something suspicious. And so I understand that there is a hacking operation. No president, neither party has done anything about it. This started when Donald Trump was president the first time. And when Joe Biden became president, he didn't do anything about it. And now that Donald Trump is president again, he still hasn't done anything about it. So I don't want to help the hackers and give them more information about what I look like. There's enough stuff out there they already know. Except I'm getting older, so I'm trying not to have pictures of me on my face on the internet, because my face is changing with age. More wrinkles, more bags, more sags. Not as pretty as I used to be, although I always had a healthy crop of pimples. I'm going to begin this and talk about the generational child sex abuse trauma that I went through when I was a young child. I decided not to try to tell my story all at once. There's too many things. There's good things in my life and bad things. And to try to tell the whole story all at once is just too much. So I'm just going to do maybe the first 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit more than that. And the truth is, my conscious memories of my life begin when I was 4 years old, going on 5 years old, just a few months before my 5th birthday. And what I remember is 2 teenage boys took me down into a basement and held me up for each other while they attempted to penetrate me. You know, I don't know what to say next. I have other memories that precede that, but that was the most vivid memory. And then what happened is, maybe a month later, my mother put my clothes in a bag and my brother's clothes in a bag, and she took us to our day babysitter. And she said that she wasn't going to come and pick us up. Sometimes she would take us to the day babysitter and she'd go shopping in the big city nearby to get stuff she couldn't get in our small town. Or sometimes she took some other special trip. But this time she didn't come back, and my dad didn't come back to pick us up. And I remember that night my brother and I slept on the floor of the babysitter's son's room, and I just cried and cried and cried. And the babysitter, this still hurts. It still hurts. The babysitter came in and yelled at me. And she said, "You've got to be quiet because you're keeping the whole house up." So I was quiet. But I was still just incredibly sad, devastated. I wondered why other people had parents who wanted them, but my parents didn't want me. That hurt so much. The computer's fading out on me. I'll have to redo this and make sure that it doesn't go dark so quickly and so easily. So you'll probably see me reaching up periodically to try to keep the computer from fading out on me. So what happened is, my brother was in school, so he went to school, and I don't remember exactly what happened because that was a long time ago, and I talked about it with my father later, And he claimed that we never spent any time overnight at the babysitters. We were just staying there during the day. But I know that that one night happened. But I think what happened is that my brother went to school during the day, and I was at the babysitters during the day. And at night we were at home with our dad, except for this first night. But what I remember that first day when my parents didn't come to pick me up is that I wondered, all the other children, their parents came and picked them up because the babysitter babysat like 10 different children. It's sort of like daycare back in the early 60s. And I wondered why all the other children had parents who wanted them and my parents didn't want me. And I know I was there for a couple weeks, and the babysitter would feed me Campbell's soup and I wouldn't eat it. And so she eventually took me to the doctor and tried to find out why my nose itches. She tried to find out why I wasn't eating, and he did something like clip the tongue, the skin underneath my tongue, so my tongue would have more space. I don't think that helped me eat anything more. I was depressed. I felt unwanted and unloved. And then after about 2 weeks, my father's aunt came to stay with us. And my father's aunt, we called her Grandmotty because that's what her grandson called her, so everybody called her that. And she was one of the most loving people that I've ever known in my life. And she stayed with us for a couple weeks, and my brother and I didn't have to go any place during the day. And Grandmotty just made me feel so loved. And then she went back home, and my dad got somebody else who stayed, who wasn't as loving as Grandmotty, but it was still, I was at home. I had my own room. I had my own dolls, my own toys to play with. I didn't feel so devastated, so lost. And I'm not mad at either one of my parents. And I remember we went to my mother, the hospital where my mother was in the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe the north end of the Bay Area. I'm not really sure. It's so long ago, I don't remember. We visited my mother in the hospital at least once, and I don't remember her. At least I remember doing that. I don't remember the hospital at all. But we went by a model of San Francisco Bay, and my father, I remember that really being very interesting. Now, to say we didn't live in San Francisco. We lived in a rural area north and east of San Francisco. But the whole point is just how devastating that loss of a parent was. And eventually, towards the end of summer, my mother came home, and things were stable for a while, maybe for several years. But I was bullied in school. I was a nerd. I was the top student. If I had been in the San Francisco Bay Area or in Pasadena, California, or greater Los Angeles, I would have been a good student, but I wouldn't have been the top student. And what happened, it started in 5th grade. My parents were also older, so it was the 1960s, so they had mini skirts and they had bright colors and all kinds of things my parents just didn't understand and didn't like. And in 5th grade, the kids began to tease me and ask me how come I wore these long skirts that went down to my knees. How come I wore this clothing that was very old-fashioned, that had like maybe a blouse and a jumper made out of plaid, and I had ankle socks. I didn't have knee socks like everybody else, and I had Oxford shoes. So how come I dress like that? And it wasn't my choice. It was my mother dressed me. It was what she wore in the 1920s and 1930s. And she was not particularly, my parents were just horrified by the 60s and the early 70s. They hated everything about it. And so they just didn't dress me like that. But it was really hard on me. For my brother, it wasn't so big because fashion didn't affect the boys' clothing the way it affected the girls' clothing. And then when I was in 7th grade, 2 girls sat behind me, and they wanted to sit next to each other. And I usually moved. and I didn't move. I didn't want to move. So when they asked me to move so they could sit next to each other, I said no. Finally, after saying yes and yes and yes and always moving, I felt, why do I have to move? Why do I have to do what these girls want? So I said no. So they started coloring on my blouse. And I was just, the teacher didn't do anything. The kids just were allowed to bully me. And finally, I picked up my book and swatted the girl behind me. And then I was sent to the principal's office. And I went home that day, and I was just so depressed. My parents decided not to send me to school. Now remember, I was a really good student. So the school said because I was such a good student that I could stay home. But as the weeks passed, I didn't get less depressed. I stayed depressed. And so what my parents did is they decided to send me back east to my relatives who lived in a place called Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And so I went to live in Sandy Hook, and I went to middle school there for 1 year. I spent 7th grade there, and nobody bullied me. Nobody teased me. I wasn't in the very top. They had a lot of really smart students. I wasn't in the very top grade of or top class of kids, because they separated the classes according to ability. I was in the second to the top. And it was just, the coursework was more interesting. I had more freedom. And I had a friend, a really good friend named Amy. I won't say her last name because her father is actually not super famous, but moderately famous. And so I don't want to cause a problem. But her father was a cartoonist for the New Yorker magazine, and my mother took the New Yorker. And so I used to read the New Yorker magazine. It got me interested in literature and in writing. I was already interested in science because my background. My father studied physics at Caltech. My mother was really smart. She was a math major in college. So I had a very strong background in science. But the New Yorker magazine got me interested in literature and writing. And so it was so exciting that I had a friend whose father was a cartoonist in the New Yorker magazine. And so it was really kind of a special experience. But there was a difference between my parents and my uncle and aunt. My uncle and aunt were very conventional. And I had grown up watching National Geographic specials with my parents, and we watched specials on Louis Leakey digging up early human fossils in Africa, and Jane Goodall watching chimpanzees, studying chimpanzees in Africa. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a physical anthropologist. I wanted to either dig up fossils or observe chimpanzees or something like that. I wanted to go into life science. And my uncle and aunt kept on telling me that I should just get married and have kids, because that's what women do. So I went back home to stay with my parents because my parents encouraged such dreams. They didn't discourage them. They didn't tell me not to do them. They told me that I should be free to do that. And my uncle and aunt were functional, and they were good. They're very, very, very good people. There's nothing wrong with them. It was just that they were conventional and had conventional ideas. And my parents encouraged me to explore and to be who I was. So that's the whole thing about my life, is my childhood was very, very hard at times, but it was also very, very good. And what my parents did wrong, they really did seriously wrong. What they did right, they did really right. But what happened after I came home is my parents separated and divorced, and then my mother began drinking. She became an alcoholic. And I will talk about my high school years later, but they were devastatingly hard because of my mother's alcoholism. And she passed away when I was 28, and so she never met her grandchildren. I didn't have my children until late in life. My father was still alive when I was pregnant with my first child. So he knew I was going to have a baby, but he died while I was pregnant. Um, but anyway, what happened after my son was born? No, actually, yeah, after my son was born, a few years after my son was born, in after my daughter was born, when I was in my 40s, my cousin called me up, and she told me that our aunt had told her that our mothers and the aunt, the three daughters in the family, were all chronically sexually abused by our grandfather. And I had been told that my mother's diagnosis, my father had said that her diagnosis was psychosis. What psychosis refers to, I'm a former psychiatric nurse as well as a former wildlife and fisheries biologist. It refers to someone who has a departure from reality, that their mind doesn't work right and they're not always in the real world. So I think when my mother, she had said that she was sexually abused as a child, I think that probably the doctors in the hospital thought that, well, that couldn't happen. No decent father would do that. That's not reasonable. And so she got diagnosed with psychosis. But when I look back on it, particularly with what I know, now we know so much more about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think my mother definitely was sexually abused by her father. And her bouts of depression and her other struggles were all based on that. So that's the story. I'm a victim of generational child sex abuse trauma. Now, I went through more trauma afterwards, but I fortunately was mature enough and had enough experience and enough background that I prevailed. I went through a high conflict child custody battle that lasted about 8 years. And I think it was more driven by my ex-husband's second wife than by my ex-husband. But it happened. I won that battle so thoroughly that the judge ordered my ex-husband to pay 90% of my attorney's fees when the case went to court, and I won. I won completely and thoroughly. But my lawyer told me that it's very rare for someone to win their 90% of their attorney's fees. And the way I won is by focusing on mental health. I took the kids, I got court order for our children to attend therapy, and I obtained a court order for my ex-husband and me to have a court-ordered parenting coordinator. And our parenting coordinator had a PhD in forensic psychology, so he was particularly skilled. And he testified for me, and when he testified, it was already obvious to my attorney that I had won, so she didn't have my daughter's therapist testify for me. It was my daughter, who I did not see for very much of for a couple years. She was the one over whom the custody battle was fought. My son just stayed with me, and he wanted to see his father, but his father didn't have much interest in seeing him. But that's another story that I'll tell later. But there is a correlation between the two. I struggled with depression and anxiety and low self-esteem for decades. But what happened with me, is my self-esteem improved because I worked as a fisheries observer on Soviet, Japanese, and Polish fishing vessels for 3.5, 4 years. I learned to speak conversational Russian. I was good at the job. I'm a small woman, but I could outwork most men. And I did that by keeping counts of fish in my head so that I wasn't picking up a fish, measuring it, what sex is it, cutting open its guts to see, does it have eggs or not. I would just count them in my head by tens and 20s or 5s. And so I worked much faster than most people. And it was a very simple thing to do. And it took me a while to figure it out, but I figured it out. And so I was able to outwork men who were much bigger than me, who could lift baskets of fish much more easily than I could. And So I did extremely well at that, and that improved my self esteem. But I still had bouts of depression. And when it was, of course, when I didn't see my daughter for a couple years, that made me very sad. I loved her and I missed her. But when the court case was over and I had won, I realized that my depression was gone and it never came back. Even if I had challenges, and I've gone through challenges since then, plenty of them, the depression never came back. So all the mental health things I did, they worked. That's the point. Mental health skills such as nonviolent communication or mindfulness meditation, they don't work like you take a drug, you take an antibiotic and it kills the organism. You take a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug and your headache goes away. That's like ibuprofen or aspirin. They don't work like that. You have to rebuild. Trauma actually damages the structures of the brain, and you have to rebuild them. And it takes a while to rebuild the damaged structures of your brain. And so, two things I would say to people: learn mindfulness meditation or yoga, or centering prayer is what I used. There's a variety of things. Hiking in nature is a big one. Just start hiking in nature and practice awe. That it helps to heal the damaged structures of the brain. And then learn skills you didn't know before. And a valuable one is nonviolent communication, and another one is dialectical behavioral therapy. Teaches a whole range of skills that can help you. To learn how to heal and document abuse, you can buy my book on Amazon.com. How to Heal, a workbook for survivors by a survivor, plus tips for documenting abuse by V. Jones. Additional help is available on my blog, compassionategathering.blogspot.com, and my Facebook, the Family Mental Health and Child Custody Act.